Phenomenon that might be observed in the presence of a monopoly is price discrimination. Price discrimination is in a situation where different people pay different prices for the same good. There is no justification in cost differences, so it could be charging the different prices for adults or students at the movie theater when each of them only take up one seat, charging different prices on an airplane, charging different prices for anything that has the same cost. So on an airplane, for it to be price discrimination, you'd have to have two people that are potentially sitting in equivalent seats and paying different prices due to different attributes that they may have or so on. Of course, if you're dealing with first class and economy, well then the price discrimination is not valid, because in that situation you're not talking about the same service. It makes sense to charge more for more services. It makes sense to charge more because they have larger seats, they take more space, they have better food, more service, more people working for them, and so on. Price discrimination is where you have the same good facing different prices by different people. So what are the conditions required for there to be price discriminations? Well, firms must have some monopoly or market power. So when I say here some, an example of a firm that doesn't necessarily have complete monopoly power could be a movie theater in Sherbrooke. So example here, movie theater. Okay. They don't have absolute monopoly in the sense that they're the only movie theater you could go to in Sherbrooke. There's La Maison de Cinéma, which offers more the English movie sections in downtown Sherbrooke. Or you have Cineplex, which is closer to Rock Forest, which are the two main movie theaters. So this is a situation that they have some monopoly power, but not necessarily complete monopoly power. No resale of the goods is possible between consumers. It's impossible for a student to buy a load of tickets and then go outside and see some adults and sell them the tickets to make a profit, and for both to profit, so at a price in between the students and the adults' price. It's impossible because once you have that ticket and you go to traverse, if you have a student ticket, you might have the person at the entrance asking to see your ID. Same thing with bus services. If you take the bus from Sherbrooke to Montreal, make sure that if you buy a student ticket, you have your student ID ready just about the time that you're going to board the bus. So no resale is possible. Otherwise, price discrimination will not occur. Different consumers have different elasticities of demand, and we're going to see how this works when we look at ordinary price discrimination. It's just the idea that people are not necessarily the same, because if both groups of people were exactly the same, you wouldn't have an incentive to price discriminate. And we'll see how that works when we look at price discrimination in a second. Okay. So there's two big categories, which will be perfect price discrimination. This is rare or completely absent, but it's just good to kind of show what's going on. And this is very common, ordinary price discrimination. You might realize sooner afterwards, after seeing this video, that ordinary price discrimination happens quite commonly. If you think of just people who have CAA memberships getting discounts or different things like that, there's a lot of discounts for different types of groups of people out there. So what is perfect price discrimination? Well, here it's a situation that the firm has perfect information about consumers' demand, implying that the firm can change its price accordingly to what people are willing to pay. Okay, so we have this situation that they observe how much people are willing to pay, and then they charge accordingly. So I'm just going to do a little graph here to highlight this. So when we draw a demand curve, we said that the demand curve and the willingness to pay are linked. And at the same time here, when we drew demand curves initially in chapter 3, we often said that the demand curve is a combination of many individual demand curves makes this market demand. Therefore, if you think of buying a computer or buying something else, well, here at one unit, there is one person that's willing to pay this price to getting maybe a computer or getting a trip somewhere exotic or something else. Okay. But if you lower the price a little bit, well, then there's a second person that's willing to come. Or it could be the same person paying himself this same product twice. But essentially, you could think about it as being a second person. So there's this first person's willing to pay this amount. Second person's willing to pay that amount. So if it's that price, you get both. And then a third person is willing to pay this amount, and so on and so forth. So as you drop the price, you're getting the previous customers that you're already getting at a certain price, but you're also getting these new customers as well. So in this case here, imagine that this guy was willing to pay $11,000 or whatever for this product. This one, $10,500. This one, $10,000. Well, you have a situation that if you have this information on these individuals, you could say, well, the first person is going to pay $11,000. The second person, so let's say this is Jack, is going to pay $11,000. Jim is going to pay $10,500. Jerry's going to pay $10,000, and so on and so forth. So because you can perfectly discriminate between all individuals and you have absolute information on how much people are willing to pay, you could do this. Yeah. This doesn't really happen. You might see some of it through negotiations in poorer countries when you go to the market to buy something, a piece of clothing or anything else. They might try to feel what your maximal willingness to pay is. So when you ask how much is this shirt, they might say $100. And then you're like, oh, not interested. And then they'll drop the price till you reach something that you're willing to pay. Probably below your maximal willingness to pay, but still something that you're willing. But someone else may walk in 15 minutes later, end up paying less than you or end up paying more than you. So this is a bit of price discrimination based on how much you're willing to pay. So an example of this is market shopping in some countries where the price is not written on the product and you have a rough idea of how much it's actually worth. Okay, so if this were to happen and I add this kind of like, let's say this is for one specific firm, so I have a marginal cost curve, which we said resembles a supply curve. This is the market demand that I have. What would be marginal revenue? Well, in this case here, because I'm charging 11 to the first person, 10.5 to the second, 10 to the third, I don't have to drop the price on the previous ones. So in this case here, my demand curve is also my marginal revenue curve. Where would I stop? Well, I would stop here because I would not produce a good that I could only sell this amount and it cost me this amount. So this would be my quantity produced, my quantity over perfect price discrimination. And if you think this intersection point, this is the same as we had for the quantity over for perfect competition. So the quantity is good. What's the problem here is if we think about all of this area here, this whole amount here, it's no longer divided midway between consumer surplus and producer surplus. Here we're in a situation where all surplus is producer surplus. Why is that? Well, this producer knows exactly how much people are willing to pay. He charges that amount so people don't make an excess gain on that purchase. And since their cost is much lower than that specific price, all surplus is producer surplus. Okay. A little bit extreme scenario, but you could still see it happening in certain instances. And that's the situation where they keep on changing the price based on how they feel you're willing to pay. Ordinary price discrimination, on the other hand, is very common. It's charging different customer groups different prices based on their elasticity of demand. So I'm just gonna... Okay, so if we were to look at going to the movie theater and we were to try to see the difference between a situation where we have adults, so young professionals, people that have a job, no longer in school, earning a certain amount of money, and we have students. Okay. We look at both of these groups and we try to see what their demand curve would look like. If we were to aggregate all adults and all students together, what would their demand curves look like? Yeah. So if I think about this, if I think of adults versus students, who would have the maximal or highest willingness to pay to go see a movie? If I think about these two, maybe a student, or for most students, if you start charging somewhere like $10, $15 dollars, then they're going to stop going to the movies altogether. So the maximum here may be like 15, and there you only get like a few students, very few. It could be even less, like 15 is a little high actually. For Canada. For other countries, they're used to paying more, but for Canada it is. Whereas adults, on the other hand, we have a situation that maybe the adults, there's still some adults that would be willing to see it at, let's say, a higher price, whatever that price be, it's higher. This I might change it just to 12. Okay? So we have this situation. And then I asked myself, and the reason why that students are not willing to pay more is they kind of see they have limited income. Even though they want to see a movie, they'll wait for it to be available online. For $12, they could buy a 12 pack or something else, so that's their trade-off. Whereas the adult, if they really want to see the movie, they'll pay the higher price for it. But if the price goes down, if it starts dropping down to, let's say, $5 or something else, the student, there might be a lot of students that end up going to see the movie because at a lower price, at a much lower price, they think it's worthwhile. They love the cinematic experience. They have time, and they decide, instead of going out, they decide to go to the movies, or they do a mixture of the two. Something happens. Instead of renting movies, they go to the movies. Whereas some of the adults will be in a situation that if the price drops, even if it drops very low, to a very low amount, they might be in a situation that they won't see that many movies because they're very busy, they have kids, they have busy lives, and they have other things to do. So maybe if the price drops, they'll still just see a few movies. So all in all, you could think that the demand for the adults versus the demand, this should be a D, for the students is quite different. Demand for the adults is quite steeper. Demand for the students is quite flatter. If you can make sense of this, this is not something that was created. It's just if you can make sense of it, well then afterwards, let's see what would happen if these were two separate monopolies. Well, what we have to add here to determine our choice is our marginal cost curve, and I try to draw it as identical as possible on both graphs because the cost for a cinema seat, whether it's a student or an adult of the same size, doesn't change anything. So based on this marginal cost and demand, well, what's going to happen to the price? Well, what's missing here to determine the optimal price and quantity is we need to add a marginal revenue curve. So if I add a marginal revenue curve, here it's twice as steep. It should be steep like this. It's my marginal revenue curve for my adults, and here, because it's relatively flat, the other one will be relatively flat as well. I might have made it a little steep, and this will be my marginal revenue for my students. Okay. So I have this situation here. If I look at what price will be charged and what quantity will be consumed, well, where MR is equal to MC will be my quantity of students. Here, my quantity of adults. What will be the price? Well, the price for the students here may be $8. And here for the adults, I'm going up. And then I might notice that for the adults, it's $12. Okay. So this situation that happens, this price discrimination that happens for a lot of students when you see special prices on student fares, and let's say a few years back I went to Australia and I was very surprised, I was still a student, that there was no student fares at the movie theater there. And I thought, wow, these people don't really care about students. In Canada, we're nicer. The movie theaters and other places, bus services and stuff like that, charge a lower price for students. It's just because they kind of remember how things were and everything else. Well, actually, some of them might be a little nice, but most of them are simply profit maximizing. Okay, this whole procedure here, the goal behind it is to profit max. Because if you were to choose a common price between the two, let's say $10, well, you wouldn't be profit maximizing for the adults. You wouldn't be profit maximizing for the students, because at $10 you might get very few students, so you're not making much profit off of them. At $10 here you might get a couple more adults, which is not really worthwhile. So by price discriminating, you have a situation that you could make more money by charging the appropriate price for all groups. So it's not as extreme as perfect price discrimination, where you really choose how much to charge on every individual based on their own willingness to pay, but it's still splitting into groups, and the goal behind it is to make more profits. So here we can notice that the adult is much less responsive to a change in price. He would be what we would put as category inelastic, and because of that, he's going to pay a higher price. Whereas here we're dealing more with an elastic demand. They're much more responsive, so we don't want to charge a high price to these people, or else we'll lose all of the customers.